PhD. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Amber. So I will start us off. My name is Kai. I'm a graduate student in the Community Psychology PhD program at Wilfrid Laurier University and co-host with Dr. Carly Trott of the Environment and Justice Interest Group. And we haven't had a meeting for a few months, but we are very, very grateful for this one and for Serdar to be joining us and sharing on such an important topic of our time. Militarism versus peace and justice, and the intersections with psychology and climate change. Carly, anything you would like to share, or we can dive into this?
Yeah, hi everybody. Just quickly, if you have an interest in sharing your own research at a future environment and justice interest group, we're always looking for people who have ongoing projects that they wish to share. So we don't actually have our next person in the lineup for our quarterly calls. So that would be probably a few months from now, maybe May or June, something like that. But if you're interested and available to do so, feel free to reach out to me or Kai, and we can work with you to try to pick a day and time that would work for you.
Yeah, thanks. So, Serdar, I will hand this over to you for a bit of context around your work, and thank you for joining us from Goethe University. Am I pronouncing that right, in Germany?
Goethe University.
Goethe. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us, and I can share my screen and hand it over to you.
Thank you. Kai asked me to introduce myself with a few brief words. I'm a developmental psychologist by training and a community psychologist by conviction. That's how I introduce it in most cases. And I also consider myself a peace psychologist for various reasons, but in terms of practical work. And my interest in militarism is a very critical one because I grew up in an environment that was heavily infused with militarism. And in no uncertain terms, my life has been shaped by militarism when I was growing up in Turkey. But what I noticed over the years was the fact that many people, including psychologists, were extremely reluctant to address militarism in its tones and shades and forms. This applied to Turkey, and this also applied to the US, where I did my PhD. And however, more recently, because I follow militarism so very closely, I started to get more and more interested in climate change or climate collapse, if you will. And that's why today I am in front of you talking about the intersection of militarism and how it relates to climate change or the impending climate collapse. So the plan is that I will take about 25 minutes max and do the presentation, and then hopefully we will have a lively discussion. And this is based on a paper that is soon going to be published in South Africa in a journal called Psychology in Society, emphasizing the fact that psychology can actually serve public interest. And that is a journal that I was hoping would be very open to this, and it's going to appear actually in a special issue. So let's get started. And Kai, first one, please. I'm not going to talk a lot about the facts of climate change, but all we know is that things are not going well. There was a very recent report, some of you might have heard, the most recent report about the facts and the trends are not, or is not a very positive report. The next one, please. I thought I should share a photo from Germany too. This is from last year when floods damaged and actually created a very unexpected damage in certain parts of the country. The next one, please. And many people now are talking about climate change and climate collapse, something that I think is better description for what's happening. We don't exactly know the exact dates when certain things will happen, but it is predicted that if certain things are not or do not change, things are going to end up in a very drastic fashion. So let's go to the very first one. As some of you already know, psychology was not an early joiner in the study of climate change. Psychology joined this study of climate change rather late. And one of the important steps, or a very visible step, was the creation of a task force under APA. And it was a task force that was started by the Council of Representatives. So it had a collective force behind it. So this task force created a report and worked over about a year in 2008 and 9. And the task force focused primarily on mainstream psychological research into changing behaviors. And the report argued that psychologists were experts on motivations and psychological factors. I mean, this is like reading through an introductory textbook. Psychologists are experts on human behavior, behavior change, so on and so forth. But let's take a look at the recommendations from this report. And the recommendations, which is the next slide, are as follows. Integrate information about environmental sustainability into the psychological curriculum. Prepare therapists for increased stress and anxiety that may result from climate change. Encourage research and applied science via awards and grants from American Psychological Association. Distribute informational materials to the public and policymakers so that they understand how useful psychologists can be. So there is a very clear, very salient emphasis on the know-how, so to speak, from psychology. And lobby government officials at all levels to consider psychological expertise in the legislation process. Let's go to the next one. The argument is that psychology is very well suited to address the problem. The APA Council of Representatives reiterated the argument in 2011 and clearly argued that psychology was well equipped to address this issue. Well, if you ask me back 10 years ago, I would say that that was not the case. Today, I'm even more convinced that psychology is actually not well suited. But that was the argument that I would like to present to you. Now, the number of publications over the last 10 years has increased. I don't exactly know the numbers. The exact numbers actually not important. The issue is that there is a big literature right now in psychology focusing on climate change. However, the emphasis in the current literature is on how climate change influences psychological well-being. To me, a very clinical type of focus. How do we look at how individuals feel, how they adapt, so on and so forth. Let's go to the next one, please. Now, what I argue in the paper and here is that there is a systematic gap. If you do a careful review of the literature, what you find is that armed conflict, war, and militarism as a whole has been systematically neglected. Many psychologists argue that individuals must think differently about climate change so that they can change their behavior. But I would say that psychologists should do the same. They should change the way they look at this issue so that psychology can actually make a difference regarding impending climate collapse. So what has been missing is the impact of military activities on climate change. There isn't any emphasis on the impact of military activities in the psychological literature. A similar gap actually exists regarding the negative impact of military activities on the environment and on humans via environmental destruction. So what I see as my goal here, and I think others should probably adopt the same goal, it's important to assess and expose this systematic gap. Let's go to the next one, please. So what some psychologists and others have argued is that the environment is the invisible or the silent casualty of militarism. The impact of military forces and weapons are not limited to the times of open war. There's, of course, this notion of open war, covert war, or low-profile war, etc., but let's not get into that. What is important is that the environment suffers from military activities in multiple ways. And one obvious way is the contamination of natural resources, such as groundwater. The impact of military contamination is best documented, to the best of my knowledge, in the United States, where toxic waste dumps and associated risks to human health and the environment received public attention in the late 70s. And in the 80s, there was an important response at the level of the legislation, and there was a Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act that was produced. This is informally known as the Superfund. And the Environmental Protection Agency was supposed to oversee all the cleanup efforts. Let's go to the next one. So I informed myself about the Superfund. Let's go to the next one, please. The Superfund is very interesting to read, and it's actually heartbreaking. And if you like, there are actually very, very well-produced documentaries. What's particularly stunning for me is that there's very little interest in psychology, in the kind of damage that's related to the Superfund, military activities that are associated with. There is virtually no research in psychology on environmental decline around Superfund sites. So it is as if there are local communities around these Superfund sites, and whatever they experience is not really interesting, important, particularly from the community psychology angle. So the very few existing publications are about the psychology and economics of Superfund. And some of you might guess, particularly those of you from the United States, they have to do with property values. If there is a Superfund, then Superfund site, that has a big impact on the property values and so on and so forth. In other words, there is a small piece of literature on this, but it focuses on property value losses rather than the pollution and the environmental damage. Let's go to the next one, please. The environmental destruction is actually often portrayed as unintentional. So if there is a Superfund site, it is as if the military forces are there, but they unintentionally contaminate the underground resources, underground water, so on and so forth. So it's unintended damage. But the reality is that military forces around the world have used environmental destruction as part of their war strategy. One particular case, very well documented case, is the case of the war on Vietnam. The napalm, an incendiary weapon, and Agent Orange, a chemical specifically used to eliminate existing ecosystems. These two weapons were used excessively in Vietnam, and trees were literally an enemy. And the land was actually a testing site for various weapons. Napalm, I have examined napalm over the last 15 years extensively, so I'm not going to focus on that much. But Agent Orange was even further an extremely important example for the current talk, because it was designed to destroy the ecosystem and thereby eliminate the enemy hideouts. Therefore, there was an Operation Ranch Hand that was started in 1961, I believe, and for a decade or so, Agent Orange was sprayed over South Vietnam, and to such an extent that it still exists today in the land and in the bodies of the people who were contaminated by Agent Orange. And a secondary goal, of course, was to starve the guerrilla forces, but the starvation didn't only happen at that point in time, it also continued afterwards because the influence of Agent Orange did not stop in 1 decade or 2 decades. Some activist scholars have called this systematic and total destruction of the ecosystem in Vietnam and ecocide. So the term ecocide became popular at that point. Let's go to the next one, please. Now let's focus on something that currently is being debated because it looks like Putin is using this card. And again, nuclear weapons are on the agenda. Well, one thing that should be clear is that nuclear weapons are always a threat, even at times of so-called peace. It is because of 2 reasons. One is that nuclear testing doesn't stop, nuclear testing continues, and it appears that many Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's have happened over time since 1945 because nuclear testing is continuing. And the second threat is that nuclear weapons are stored in places, nuclear sites and nuclear waste continuously contaminate the environment around these sites. Nuclear waste defies solutions for permanent environmental cleanup and safety, and that is in and of itself a huge problem. Another obvious issue is that nuclear weapons are often beyond scrutiny because they are treated as state secrets. And if they are located on US bases around the world, there are about 800 US bases around the world, they are weapons, but the army or the US military is not accountable because they are not located in the United States proper. Now, what's particularly striking is that mainstream psychologists have shown very little or no interest in nuclear weapons, nuclear contamination, the aftermath of nuclear tests, and not only in the colonized lands, but also in places such as Nevada and so on in domestic territory. Mainstream psychologists have also shown very little interest in the aftermath of the nuclear attacks in 1945 on 2 cities in Japan. So it appears that these 2 major incidents where thousands and thousands of people perished, those events were not of interest to psychologists. So the gap appears to be very clear. And if you look at it, the gap appears to actually enlarge. Let's go to the next one, please. I'm trying to check the time. Let's see. How much time do I have? Does anybody know?
I think at least another 10 minutes. It's just
Okay,
11:20.
Okay.
Yeah.
So currently, some people are particularly interested in talking about the footprint. The footprint is one way of thinking about the impact of military activities on our world. There's really growing awareness of the carbon footprint, and even high-level generals are quite open about what the carbon footprint is and how big it is. What we know is that the military forces are contributing a huge amount to the carbon or the greenhouse gases. Let's take the invasion of Iraq. Some of these information you can easily find with the click of, or 2 clicks perhaps, on your computer. Some of it is buried in the literature. But the invasion of Iraq, you can easily find, has led to an enormous destruction, not only in Iraq, but globally. At the outset of the invasion in 2003, the US Army estimated that it would need more than 40 million gallons of fuel for the first 3 weeks. You would, of course, never hear this from George W. Bush. He wouldn't say that this is a huge amount, so on and so forth, because they are interested in glorifying the war. Between 2003 and 2007, the invasion generated at least 140 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Each year of the war, this amount of carbon dioxide exceeded the total amount of about 140 countries released annually. So one single war that was fought right next to where I am from, Turkey, released this much carbon dioxide. Now, the next thing that most people don't think about, rebuilding bridges, roads, hospitals, schools, so on and so forth, that were destroyed during the invasion and afterwards. The construction of new security walls, barriers, etc. All of that also contributes to climate change because this requires millions and millions of tons of cement, one of the largest industrial sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Let's go to the next one, please. Okay, so that takes us to a suspect that some of you might have heard of. The usual suspect, actually the only suspect, is the US military. Let's go to the next one. What we know today very clearly is that the largest single climate polluter and contributor to the global warming is the US military forces or the US armed forces. And you can talk about different ways of looking at this, but it is clear that one single institution is destroying what we all live in, which is something that's fundamentally existentially important to us. And what we also know is that the military presence and high level of expenditures per soldier, regardless of the country, not just in the United States, wherever it might be, is directly linked to the scale and intensity of carbon dioxide emissions. So to put it clearly or simply, the bigger the army, the bigger the investment, the bigger the damage to the world, to the nature or the natural environment that we live in. So high military expenditures translate into high destruction or climate change. So the ecological damage is huge, even when there is no war. Let's go to the next one, please. Now, let's roll the clock backward to 2002. Some of you might be a little familiar with environmental psychology. Every time I look at environmental psychology, I am disappointed. And I thought it would be a good idea to look at the Handbook of Environmental Psychology from 2002 so that we can see where the problem is and how big a problem it might be. The 700+ page handbook didn't contain any mention of the environmental impact of military activities. The psychological literature on the environment and particularly on climate change has expanded, of course, since 2002. But over the 2 decades, the gap has remained. So it is very clear that mainstream psychology is either neglecting or refraining from, however you want to put it, addressing military activities, military pollution, environmental destruction, and environmental impact of nuclear weapons. They are basically ignoring these factors. It is also time to ask the same question regarding the contribution of the United States military to climate change. Now, in the paper, I answer this particularly referring to the history of psychology. In the United States, the history of psychology has about 100 years of collaboration with the armed forces. But let's leave that aside. I think it's very important to focus on, first, the militaristic narrative. The militaristic narrative that is sometimes used by very prominent psychologists, such as Martin Seligman. They argue that serving the military is serving the public. Serving the military is serving the nation. I think it should be very clear that serving the military has nothing to do with public good and has nothing to do with the welfare of individuals, communities, or the society. And if psychologists should care about the kind of role that they play, they should really think about playing a more meaningful role in any given society. It doesn't matter where on earth. They would play a better role if they focus on peace, justice, and human rights, rather than militarism and the newer term that's used to conceal militarism, national security. In the context of the environment, I think psychologists must choose to defend the planet. Defending the planet is far more meaningful than defending the nation. The nation is a group of people. The planet is all of us, including every single living thing. And so it's not anthropocentric, it's also very, very clearly inclusive. In the context of climate change, I argue that psychologists can chart a better course of action if they focus on environmental justice rather than on environmental security. And if you use the term environmental security and look at it, what you will see is that climate change has been securitized. In other words, it is used to argue that military forces are necessary because climate change will lead to wars. We need more war-making mechanisms, in other words, the military, to have a secure world in the context of climate change. Let's go to the next one, please. In community psychology, for some reason, prevention, and I mean primary prevention, is fading away. I think if we want to move away from militarism, and in the context of climate change, primary prevention is a key principle. The psychological literature on climate change, focusing on the individual decisions, individual well-being, misses the entire point of prevention. What's needed is prevention rather than focusing on what climate change does to individuals. And I always quote George Albee, because he kept on repeating this very important principle. We cannot prevent a mass disorder by treating individuals. You have to address the root causes so that every individual is protected, so that the problem is prevented. And finally, rejecting militarism serves public health. I mean, again, this is something that is not necessarily very well emphasized in community psychology nowadays. The more community psychology moves away from public health, the more it loses its spirit. Rejecting militarism serves public health at a global scale because it opens up the possibilities for peace and justice and directly addresses two real threats, two existential threats, namely nuclear annihilation and climate collapse. Okay, I think I'm about to finish. What's next? Okay, so this is probably where I should stop. Psychology should really take climate change or put climate change in a different light, because the current emphasis on looking at the individuals really is not helping. Thank you. I think it was